550 KTRS. Doug McElvin in from McGraw Mail Haven. He will return tomorrow. Molly Hunter with ABC News joins us now. Hi, Molly. How are you on this Monday?
Good morning, Doug. Doing well.
I hope you're a friend of Mr. Putin, because otherwise somebody might draw a bathtub on your head, or you might get run over by a truck, or former friends.
You don't have a fighting chance if you're not a friend of Putin.
I was going to say, and it looks like a number of people are finding out the hard way that Mr. Putin is playing hardball. This story I'm looking at says some 500 plus people have been arrested in Moscow alone while protesting Mr. Putin and his government. Quite the deal.
That's exactly right, Doug, and that number is even higher countrywide. The number that we're looking at is about 1,000 people detained across the country, and the largest unauthorized protest in years. It was yesterday, an extremely rare sight in Russia for the reasons that you just gave. But people took to the streets in nearly 100 cities, and it was led by Alexei Navalny, who is Putin's arch nemesis, opposition leader, and anti-corruption activist, who called for these protests, told people to get out in the streets, and they were protesting corruption in the government, what they see as corruption with the Kremlin, what they see as corruption with Russia's prime minister right now, who was incidentally skiing yesterday when an Instagram user asked him what he was doing. He said he was on the slopes. But this is incredibly serious. These are the biggest pictures, the biggest numbers that we've seen in at least 5 years. I will say, Doug, at least one American journalist was also detained. He was then released, a man named Alec Lunn, who works for The Guardian, and he tweeted he was released after just 5.5 hours after being arrested at the Navalny protest and charged with holding an unsanctioned rally.
Now, as I understand it, this is a little bit different when it came to a rally/march, in the sense that sometimes these things can get quite violent, but in this particular case, no big banners with anti-government slogans. In fact, it was more of a walk down one of the major streets there and showing their feelings discreetly, which might have helped, I guess, some, but not enough to keep Putin and his police force from going after them.
That's exactly right, Doug. They say it was a walk. They were walking. They weren't holding these big protests. They didn't have big megaphones. They were chanting. But police moved right in and started rounding people up. And now there are certain people still in custody this morning. We did just see that leader I mentioned, Alexei Navalny, in court. He was just handed a 15-day sentence. And he just tweeted actually a selfie photo from court. He says, "Hello from court. The time will come when we will judge them, only we'll do it fairly." Now, he also runs an anti-corruption organization, which he fears will be shut down in the aftermath of this.
Even if you ignore the politics of the beast, Putin is a very popular man in Russia, right?
That's exactly right. His approval rating is still incredibly high. So, yes, while 7,000 or 8,000 people hit the streets in Moscow, across the country, his numbers are still soaring. The Kremlin did actually respond in kind of a rare response, Doug. They called this provocation and lies, and state media barely mentioned it.
Now, he has expected, or I don't know that he's formally announced, but he's expected to seek another term as president in elections that are scheduled to come up next year, if memory serves correctly, in which case he would be, he'd be prime minister and president longer than almost anybody else in Russia at the time, and apparently doesn't face much in the way of real opposition, right?
That's exactly right, especially if Alexei Navalny is completely off the radar. He is now barred from running because of another felony that has been repeatedly brought against him, charge that has repeatedly been brought against him. And even though he's kind of appealing to his base of supporters to open up volunteer offices around the country, at this point, his numbers, by the polls that we've seen, don't stand a chance against Putin.
Molly Hunter from ABC News, what do you hear with regard to yet another protest walk? Or was it a one and done, or do you foresee something else along these lines happening yet again?
I think it depends a little bit about what happens with Alexei Navalny. Now, we have, as I mentioned, this is the biggest crowd that we've seen in at least 5 years when there were anti-Kremlin protests and protests against actually Navalny's prison sentence a few years ago. They certainly are brave to hit the streets in the face of obviously an incredibly strong crackdown. But we'll have to wait and see whether someone else can galvanize that kind of support, whether when Alexei Navalny gets out of prison, if he does serve these 15 days that he's just been handed, if he's able to kind of galvanize people. But there was certainly a renewed energy in the streets of Moscow. I won't go as far as to say that, it might be the beginning of something kind of much larger, but it certainly is indicative of a wide-ranging, countrywide sentiment and just frustration with what they perceive as corruption.
Here in the United States, if you're arrested during a protest like this, unless you're doing something incredibly violent or destructive, usually you're arrested, you're booked, and then you're released, usually on your own recognizance to show up at a later date and time, or there's a minor fee, a fine rather. What happens in Russia? I mean, they're dealing with all these people, I guess, and I don't know Russian law, but it seems to me they could just hang on to them for as long as they wanted to.
Absolutely, and I think they do. It's, at times, Alexei Navalny has been was dragged in yesterday, almost immediately upon arriving at the protest, sat behind bars overnight, but was on something called administrative detention, hadn't actually been charged, and there are still people awaiting charges, and there are still people who've been charged who've been released, and then there are people who are have been charged and are still awaiting some sort of trial. So I think it certainly depends kind of on who you are, who your politics, where your politics fall, and who you support, and what exactly you were doing. One woman, that picture that's going viral this morning of a woman in a dress being carried off on all fours, kind of with police lifting her up, says she wasn't even a protester and she was still carried off. So I think it certainly depends, case by case.
Thanks for fleshing things out for us a bit this morning, Molly. We appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Molly Hunter with ABC News joining us this morning here on the Big 550 KTRS. It is